Here. Welcome to the Give It Up podcast on urbanmediatoday.com, where we continue to give it up for excellence, greatness, and leadership, and where we use sports as a metaphor for life, but also in this, crazy time that we're living in between the pandemic and systemic racism and, fighting for immigrants' rights and everything else that we could talk about. We're also using community. And today I have a very, very special program. I'm just saying, as many of you know, I am going for my master's in social justice and community organizing. And I have two of my peers, my classmates, soon to be fellow social justice scholars on the podcast with me today. And we have Parker Weaver as well as Jen Heeter. They are in, and make sure I'm pronouncing you guys' names right. They are in the social justice program with me, and I'm just really excited for them to be here. Parker, just give the audience a little bit about your background, maybe where you're at and what you're into right now.
Okay, so I'm a third-year English teacher at a tiny school on the central coast of California. My background was actually at Cal Poly. I stayed in the area as an English major and a theater minor, so I have a lot of background in using theater for social justice and all of those things, and I really miss theater. I'm hoping to use it more in my classroom in the future. But my huge things I'm super interested in right now is working with my Latinx students towards college and career readiness, and actually making them feel motivated and feel their voices heard in our community, as well as our LGBTQ plus students who are basically seen as unseen on our campus and providing space for them. And I'm really excited to be in Prescott's program so that I can work for those students.
I love it. Jen, give it to us. Give it up.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here speaking with you all. My name is Jen Heeter, and I'm a public Montessori educator. So Montessori is a unique model in which we are kind of flipping the traditional system on its head and within the public sector. So we are deeply committed to access and making sure that any family that chooses Montessori can join us. I'm currently, I started out as a traditional teacher in California. And then when I found Montessori, I got two different levels of training. And taught first through third grade altogether, and then fourth through sixth grade. Now I'm working as a public Montessori principal. And so having that teaching background really ensures, or I want to ensure that I'm showing up, giving teachers all the resources that they need, and doing a lot of the legwork so they can focus directly on the students, because I think that teaching is all about relationships. I'm super excited to be a student now myself in the social justice and community organizing program. I focus heavily on anti-racist education and social justice within my work, but it's been amazing, and it's really kind of blown my mind to be exposed to all different types of social justice and community organizing. So I'm psyched to grow, even though it's making my brain explode a little bit.
And Jen and Parker, I can attest to that, because ever since I entered the program, you guys already know, all I can think about is I didn't know I was as passionate about so many things in social justice. I was like thinking social justice, okay, social justice is mainly like racism. And then I realized that no, it's everything. It's like food justice, it's policing, it's immigrants, it's LGBTQ plus, it's everything. It's debt. I mean, we could just go on and on and on about the things that like encompass social justice. It's the homeless population. I mean, I can't think of anything almost now since I've been in the program that doesn't fit the social justice genre. So yeah, I'm just happy for you guys to be here. And the title that I decided to title this episode of the podcast is The Verdict Before and After. So everybody knows by now that Derek Chauvin was found guilty for the murder of George Floyd, but I want to sort of rewind the clock and go before even George Floyd's death and just talk a little bit about how did you see America dealing with social justice or systemic racism issues prior to George Floyd, did you have any hope that America could do better? Just before even, the video that we saw of him being murdered was out there, and anybody can jump in.
I think for me, Ava DuVernay's The 13th was like the first time I had finally seen almost like a researched, fully articulated argument about the prison system and mass incarceration. And I actually use it in my classroom. So it was really interesting. My first year teaching, I used that documentary along with The Scarlet Letter, which is way old school, how women responded to incarceration and how women were treated who had kids. That's kind of the direction we go. We actually do a full debate. But what intrigued me is like using that the last 2 years and then using that this year after George Floyd and like where that played into it. So it was like the first time that I'd seen media actually have a bipartisan conversation in one location talking about systemic racism and mass incarceration, and not, it was very well crafted. And I do address with my students that there's obviously a bias, but it was just so expansive. And they officially made it free on YouTube, which was huge. After George Floyd, they like released it on YouTube. It was only Netflix. So it was like all of these arguments and areas of media that was trying to expand how we talk about racism were made accessible post George Floyd. And I thought that was so interesting that before it was like very consumerism, capitalist, like focused on only certain people can watch these things. And then it became everyone should know this. So that was one of the things I recognized is like just informational sharing became different post what happened.
I love it. And the 13th, everybody out there, if you haven't seen the 13th, Ava DuVernay's documentary about the 13th Amendment, I suggest that you go to Netflix and, like you said, on YouTube at this point. Absolutely. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, for me, so I live in Oakland, California, which is a really diverse part of the world. And the area where my school is housed is actually the third most ethnically, linguistically, and racially diverse city in the nation.
Wow.
Hayward. Yeah. So we represent, 30 different home languages, no ethnic or racial majority. And so, I surround myself with people who have all sorts of different backgrounds, languages, traditions, and cultures than myself. So, and within the school sector, I got involved in anti-racism and educational access when I became a teacher. It's a second career for me. So that was about 13 years ago. And at that point, I began to see how students and families were treated differently within the school system, how students were tracked, how families were left on the margins, how who was represented within the school and within the curriculum, who was visible, whose voice wasn't there. And so really felt then I did a lot of work training, got pretty obsessed with learning about anti-racist approaches within education, and felt a lot of hope that education could be a place where systemic racism begins to be dismantled. If we're focused on healthy identity development with any attachment to inferiority or superiority, if we're really focused on explicitly teaching kids how to collaborate across difference, we can begin to shift those patterns, and that will have a effect out to the adults in the community. That being said, I'm still living within this little bubble. And so it became clear to me that like the bubble of Oakland, but then also the bubble of educators, but then also the bubble of social justice educators. And it became clear to me that, with if you just step outside that bubble in any direction, my friends still couldn't go for a walk at night with their hoodie on and feel at ease. Yeah. I felt like there was a way out, but it felt a long way away.
Yes. And then we had George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
So my question in regards to the video, did you watch it and it was was it something like, you know, when the World Trade Centers came down, September 11th, or when Martin Luther King was shot? Was it that kind of situation for you when you saw that video, and or did you see it at all? Like where were you? What were you thinking? And were you in disbelief, or was this something that was actually believable?
So I was, I follow a lot of educators, anti-racist educators on Instagram. That's where I found, that's where I learned about what had happened to George Floyd, that his life was taken by a police officer. I chose not to watch the video. I just read about it, and I remember exactly where I was. It was kind of like that, it had that monumentous experience for me, like the World Trade Center. Um, and I just felt, there was a series of things that there were just a series of things that had happened leading up to George. And that day, I just felt the air smushed out of me. I felt like I couldn't get up. I remember laying on the couch just feeling so crushed, so drained, so completely disheartened, and not at all surprised. But just that here's another situation where someone's life has been taken from them just because of how they present. And so the immensity, there was just more immense, there was a lot of immensity and weight to that.
Wow. Go ahead, Parker.
Very similarly, I also didn't watch it. A lot of what like you said, like I share current events with students, and it's becoming increasingly more hard within the last 2 years because of the way that news is going. And I like started it and then stopped it because I realized that I wasn't in a space where I could watch it without that being the center focus. I wanted to know the story, like you're talking about. I really wanted to read and kind of let myself be in that space. What was so strange for me is literally because of COVID and everything going on, I was teaching from home. I was immensely stressed out. It was before finals for us teaching finals from home, and all the other teachers weren't doing finals, but I couldn't do that. So I was trying to craft new finals, and I sporadically decided that we were going to have our wedding, even though it was like canceled because of COVID. So we had
Wow.
a literally backyard wedding, and then the next day was George Floyd.
Mm.
So it was just everything accumulating. And I remember reading about it and crying, thinking, how in the world am I going to share this with my students? And I'm in that place again with things going on in the news post. I know this is for segment number 2, but like post what happens, like I didn't know how to share that with students. I was almost like, yeah, like you're saying, crushed, because there's no way to re-articulate that where I could add hope into it. We hadn't, like, at that point, it was pre the protests, pre like literal globalization. It was, how do I make this digestible when it isn't? But also, how do I actually tell students about this without them also not being able to see any hope in it? So like it was this kind of frozen teacher moment, which I've gotten into multiple times, but it was like the biggest. There was like the tragedy of the Jewish shootings at the synagogue, and I found a way to have dialogue with
That's right.
that in my classroom. And like stuff like that, I've found ways to approach it and have discussions. And this one I'm like, I didn't know. I was mortified. I kept thinking back to how my mom, and I know Trump isn't a part of this, but like his era of legacy, how my mom said everything that he does is the exact opposite of what I want this country to be. So when terrible things happen in this country, it just seems to like pull you away from what we were hoping for. And when that happened, I was like, we just got pulled so much further back than I could have ever imagined. And I was thinking about my mom, who was an African studies major in college, and what it's like for her to hear these things that she has been fighting for since the 70s. And how it's been 50 years for her.
Wow.
And it was just really hard to process how to reprocess it. like how to share it, how to dialogue in that moment. So I kind of just froze until there was obviously more global dialogue and people actually sharing, and we saw how the movement developed. But for me, I was like, oh no, I don't know how to make this educational when it shouldn't be. It's
Yeah.
not really growth based.
And what I would say is thank you for actually talking about it in your classes, because I feel like in some corners of America and the world, life just went on. And just to speak to what you were talking about in regards to former President Trump, what the hardest thing for me has been with when these kind of things happen is to relate to people that are on the other side of it. Like I cannot really wrap my head around you understanding what happened or you watching that video and then you saying, "Oh, that was justifiable." That those are the people I can't relate to. And speaking of that, are there any particular conversations or stories that you could share that you had with people maybe that had that view, the all lives matter kind of view, or on the other side? Can you think of any stories or particular, or do you even have family members uh, that see things just totally different than you do? And it doesn't even necessarily have to be on this issue, but on social justice issues in general, because I just sort of shake my head because I don't know how you have conversations with those people.
Yeah, I think this is where, the work that we're doing in our program is so helpful because, we're looking at all the different ways that you can approach an argument, a conversation, a topic,
Yeah.
and really bring cognizance and intention to all those different entry points. For me, I feel blessed because, I serve 305 kids, right? And so they represent, if you think of them, the teaching staff as well as the community, we're about 700 or 800 people. And even though we're a public Montessori school, a lot of folks come with this like-minded intention, but that's also an assumption. And we've got police officers within our
Right.
school community, within our families. We've got really conservative and right-facing families within our community. And so I embrace the opportunity through my weekly newsletter to continue to keep race and power and privilege and dynamics and current events at the forefront. So, and unfortunately, with the sheer volume of, and now the visibility of, I'm saying something every week, which is that's intense. But making sure that we have shared language around it, and some of these, even though they're one-way conversations, I think I'd shared that in a previous post, trying to make them interactive and trying to pull people along with shared language and understanding, naming we're an anti-racist school and what that looks like, and knowing that that's going to take years and years to get folks where we are. But I sat with the word choice, right? Do I say murder? Do I say, and I just did with both George and Brianna, because their lives were taken
And
without.
that takes courage as an administrator. I just want to say that takes a lot of courage, because me, just as an African American teacher in a predominantly white affluent school district, I struggle with word choice a lot. But during this pandemic and during this whole time, I think of a renewal of civil rights, of a civil rights movement. I've just said, just like you did, I'm just going to call things the way they are. And then if there's consequences, so be it.
Exactly. Yep. And there was a family who is one of the adults in the family is a police officer, and they actually our middle school or adolescent teachers sent out a different message because they were framing the conversations and the work that they were doing in the classroom as part of that and how that relates to their curriculum. And the parents questioned the teachers. And so then I went back with, actually, I use that in my language too. This is what we're calling it what it is, and I'm happy to invite you in so we can talk more about it. They didn't respond, but just continuing to really illuminate that this is what it is. Otherwise, it won't get acknowledged and then dismantled. There's no choice, we're not ever going to get to dismantling if we can't say the words.
I love it. Go ahead, Parker.
Yeah. My conversations partially were like with my students and what that would look like, but also with my family. My dad he's a libertarian, but always says he's a Republican. He's a libertarian. And he loves playing devil's advocate, but it's taken the last year for me to be like, okay, but this isn't a place where you can be that. It's not okay to have that conversation and pretend to be on the other side for the sake of enjoying argumentation. I'm like, that's nice, but like, you have to acknowledge what side you're on and what stance you're taking on these things because that has value in it. And I think within my sphere, same as you, I do have a fairly liberal family. So he's liberal socially, conservatively, economic, but like most of my family is fairly liberal besides like one uncle who just likes pissing people off, but like he's actually liberal. There's always that guy.
Right.
And then a distant cousin of my partner's who actually got he got kicked off social media because of conspiracy theories. So that's a fun one. I'm glad we're not blood related. But the main thing was less about Floyd and more about police defunding. That is where the argument really hit for us, is like the what next part of it. Everyone kind of accepted within my sphere that he was murdered, that he was taken without cause. And it was the what next arguments, like the 8, whatever the organization on social media that was like the 8 steps. And I posted about that and had dialogues about defunding the police and where that money could go. And that's where the arguments were, is that people didn't agree with taking away money from the police. They're like, well, the police need that money for training. I'm like, well, then haven't they already done that training? Isn't that supposed to be implemented? So like Minneapolis's police actually did have retraining 5 years ago from Philando Castile, and then it didn't do anything. And now they're obviously the DOJ is going to re-look at their training processes, but they're like, why take money away that won't help them? And a lot of people had a hard idea seeing how education and mental health and social services would be more beneficial than police. There's like such a loyalty to, like, we're talking about word choice, like the idea of safety, like we've talked about in our readings, what it means to be safe, and the idea that police equals safety, which is just untrue, but people still believe that. So when you're taking money away from that, they believe that they're becoming less safe. I was like, no, you would have EMTs who have mental health training, you have more social services, you have more education, you have more crisis centers, you have suicide hotlines, you have all of those things. And it kind of instigated conversation, but slowly as more protests happened, then the conversation switched. So they were more upset about protests and we stopped talking about solutions. So they were using that as like a stopgap. Be like, oh, we were having a good conversation. They're like, but those protesters. I'm like, but that wasn't what we were talking about. We're talking about what those protesters want. And that was kind of where the difficulty is, constantly using the next new thing to avoid talking about what the next steps are. So that was like their avoidance tactic.
Yes. So speaking of protests, since you brought it up, were you guys able or were you compelled to jump into the protest? Now, let me tell you where my thoughts were. I'm one of those people that at the beginning of the pandemic, it took me 2 hours to put my groceries away because I was spraying everything down and wiping it down. So I was mad. I only left the house to go get groceries. I was basically in here like Fort Knox. I was mad when people rode past me on the street with their window down and didn't have a mask on. So for me to go out and protest, it could only take something like what happened to George Floyd. And so what happened was the first night of protest here, I didn't go. I was like, no, there's a pandemic. why are people out here? And then after the second and the third, I was like, I have to go. I was like, some things are bigger than the pandemic, and right now this is bigger than the pandemic. So I actually went out. I went to a White Allies march that was led by somebody that I knew. She was in sort of the leader of it. So I was up front, but I was socially distanced from everybody else in the crowd. So did you guys have the opportunity to protest, or how did the protests look like in your cities? That's a good question.
I did not. I was more focused on the education thing. So I was really at that time using social media to like give outlets for people in my community to know like what their resources for were if they were protesting, just because there's someone in my family who is like immunocompromised, and
Mhm.
I really
Yeah.
couldn't do that. But I was trying to use like fundraising and legal funds and all of those things. I mean, it's
Oh,
very weird because most of the protests were during the summer, so a lot of the college kids were gone, but there were some college communities. So most of it was in SLO, which is like 30 minutes away from me. And actually, it became like a national case where one of the college students, like the DA, was trying to arrest her. It was like this huge thing. And so a lot of our advocacy was for her and
mm,
her like not being arrested and having like a permanent record for protesting. And also, my area is where I live in Paso is very conservative, and there were pro police rallies and like Blue Lives Matter. And then the that did happen was super small. And then what ended up happening, which basically stopped, I was going to join, like I was ready to like finally join because we were in a safer place in July. And then there was a shooting by the police station
oh wow.
in Paso where a guy just got out of his car and started shooting at the police station. Didn't have anything to do with Black Lives Matter. People tried to blame it on that. And then basically no more protests happened in my community because of that, because of the like the group lockdown. And from there, it was just before the school year was starting. So I decided to actually focus on curriculum and make sure my curriculum that I was crafting for this year pushed harder in that direction. So I read Just Mercy. I started diving into like the educational side of things and hoping that that outlet for my students when they come back after everything that happened that summer, that we could have a genuine conversation and I would be knowledgeable. um, and that's more where I went with it, and trying to support my friends who did go out and make sure that they were safe and had money if anything happened. And that was more where I went for it.
How did it look in Oakland, California, Jen? How did things look there?
Oakland was hot. But I'm kind of like you, or I'm a lot like you in the way in which I was responding to the pandemic. I felt like it was really important to be super cautious
Yeah.
for the good of the community. So I waited a little while, and things were fast and furious in Oakland right at the onset.
Yeah.
There were there were fires, and there were smashed cars, and there were all sorts of people in the streets. Um, and then there were lots of events in solidarity and in support of Black Lives Matter. And so I started to go out a little bit more after the initial, I guess, wave, after those first few days. The what was I going to say about the weight? Well, I also focused on education, specifically around, a lot of the local information was centered then around riots, and what riots and looting, and trying to reframe those terms, and talking through, what actually happens. Actually, it's the government and the police who have been looting for hundreds of years, right? This is a response to having a contract with, and I don't know if you remember what Trevor Noah said, but he was like, we're supposed to have this contract with
Contract has been broken.
and it's not ever been there. It's this contract that we keep buying into, and we're supposed to be
Yes.
protected by, but it's never been fulfilled. So talking through that with students and families. And then I also use that, and Parker, to your point, like really getting teachers comfortable with having conversations about race and power and privilege with kids. I mean, again, we have a group of staff that I just started there 2 years ago. And so the first year we worked a lot on staff bias, barriers, norming terms. And still, even folks who had done a lot of work felt nervous. They didn't want to offend anyone. They didn't want to step on anyone's toes. They are fearful of making mistakes or potentially triggering some of our young Black students. And so really trying to create this container for teachers to feel comfortable in doing that. And then we created an anti-bias, anti-racist framework. I worked on that over the summer so that something could be, like codified for every classroom to use and progress through, focusing on the 4 goals of identity, diversity, justice, and activism.
That's bomb. I don't even want to tell you guys. This is like the fastest podcast on earth. It goes so fast, but I'm going to have you guys back and we're going to dive more into the verdict after the verdict and talk about, what next for society, for America, and really the world, because it was unexpected to get that guilty verdict on Derek Chauvin. So when you guys come back, we're going to definitely dive into that. It's been a phenomenal half an hour, and talking education with educators is my favorite thing to do. And I think that just listening to both of you in terms of what your schools are doing, and Jen, in your case, you're leading the way, and Parker, in your case, your administration is allowing you to talk about things like race, whereas I can't say the same about the system that I'm in. So I'm hoping that that we could take a few pages out of your book. So I just want to thank you guys again, Jen Heeter, Parker Weaver, and you got that like rhymes. It just sounds good, Heeter and Weaver. Thank you for being on the Give It Up podcast on Urban Media today. Shout out to Kiki, Alan, Lincoln, and Trevin. Everybody, give it up and be blessed.